The sound was like a rifle shot, a crack that split the air and echoed off the pine trees bouncing through the valley with the weight of finality. The steel tow cable, thick as a man's thumb, whipped through the rain like a living thing. A silver serpent, moving faster than thought, faster than fear, faster than the human eye could track. It slashed through the downpour, missed Private Colt Merrick's head by 3 inches, maybe 4. The kind of distance that separates breathing from bleeding, living from dying, going home from going into a box. The cable embedded itself in the bark of a pine tree with a sound like thunder. The impact shook the trunk, shook the ground, shook the 19-year-old kid who was still standing there, frozen, one hand raised to where his skull had been a heartbeat before. Cease, cease, cut the goddamn power. Lieutenant Reese Callahan's voice cracked. Not from command, from panic. Pure raw panic that stripped away 4 years at MIT, 6 months of officer candidate school, and every confident thought she'd ever had about herself. She was standing shin deep in what could only be described as liquid concrete. Brown, thick, moving with a life of its own. It wasn't mud, not really. It was clay-heavy slurry that seemed to violate the laws of physics she'd studied in those pristine classrooms in Cambridge. It didn't just hold things, it swallowed them. It consumed them. And right now it was consuming a 16-ton tactical transport truck worth $500,000. The HEMTT sat at a grotesque angle, the rear axle buried to the differential. The front wheels still visible, but useless, spinning cylinders coated in slick brown clay that offered no purchase, no hope, no mercy. Reese wiped rain from her eyes. Her hands were shaking. She noticed that, tried to stop it, couldn't. She was 24 years old. She had graduated top of her mechanical engineering class. She knew tensile strength ratings. She knew torque calculations. She knew the coefficient of friction for every material in the Army's inventory. None of it mattered. The truck wasn't moving. Ma'am? Sergeant Wade Brennan appeared beside her, 32 years old, built like a fire hydrant, with the kind of calm that comes from seeing things go wrong so many times that disaster becomes routine. He was holding a thermal scanner reading the heat signature from the recovery vehicle's winch motor. The winch is cooked. Solenoids are fried. We just burned through $30,000 of equipment and that cable snapped. He didn't finish. Didn't need to. They'd both seen how close it came. Reese kicked the tire of the stuck truck. Immediately regretted it. Her boots sank 6 inches into the muck with an obscene sucking sound. She yanked it free, nearly losing the boot entirely. "We can't be stuck," she said. Her voice sounded distant to her own ears. "We have a deadline. The colonel needs these generators at the FOB by 1600 hours. If we don't get this moving, it's my—" She stopped, took a breath. "Get the kinetic rope. We'll try a snatch recovery with the second truck." Brennan hesitated. It was a small thing, a half-second pause. But Reese saw it. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "the second truck is lighter. If we snatch it, we might pull the rescue truck into the ditch too. The suction coefficient is—" "I know the suction coefficient, Sergeant." The words came out sharper than she intended. "I calculated it. We have the horsepower. We have the physics. Rig the rope." Brennan's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Yes, ma'am." He walked away, boots squelching in the mud, and Reese was left standing there in the rain, looking at the truck that wouldn't move, feeling the weight of command settle on her shoulders like wet concrete. 6 hours earlier, the world had made sense. The briefing room at Fort Benning had been climate-controlled. 72 degrees, the coffee was hot, the overhead lights were fluorescent and steady. The map on the screen showed a simple route, 14 miles. Firebreak Road through the training grounds. A shortcut, nothing special. Colonel Hayes had stood at the front of the room, gray-haired and granite-faced, with the kind of presence that made lieutenants sit up straight. 3 HEMTT trucks, he'd said. 3 Mark 7 generators. Field Hospital Alpha needs power by 1600 hours. They're running on battery backup right now, and we've got 12 critical patients on ventilators. Those batteries die, those patients die. Am I clear? "Yes, sir," Reese had said. She was the only one who spoke. Wade Brennan and Colt Merrick sat behind her silent. Hayes had looked at her. Really looked. The kind of look that measured and weighed and found you wanting before you even opened your mouth. "This is your first independent command, Lieutenant Callahan." "Yes, sir." "Your father was a good officer." Past tense, was 5 years since the training accident. 5 years since Captain Daniel Callahan had been lowered into the ground at Arlington with full honors and a folded flag that Reese kept in a box she couldn't bring herself to open. "Thank you, sir," she'd said, kept her voice level. "Don't disappoint me." No, sir. Hayes had dismissed them. Brennan had caught up with her in the hallway outside. Ma'am, he'd said, weather report says there's a storm system moving in. Might want to consider delaying until we follow the schedule, Sergeant. Reese had kept walking. We have a mission. We execute. Brennan had fallen silent, and now 6 hours later, standing in the rain with $1 million truck buried to the frame and a cable that had nearly decapitated one of her soldiers, Reese understood what that silence had meant. He'd known, and she'd been too proud to listen. The kinetic rope was a marvel of engineering. 40 feet of braided nylon designed to stretch under load and then contract using stored elastic energy to yank a stuck vehicle free. Reese had studied the physics in school, had written a paper on it actually, had gotten an A. Theory and practice, she was learning, were very different things. They rigged the rope between the stuck HEMTT and the recovery vehicle. Colt Merrick was behind the wheel of the recovery truck, his face pale in the side mirror. The kid was scared. Reese didn't blame him. He'd just watched a cable miss his head by inches. On my mark, Reese called out. Rain hammered against her helmet. Steady acceleration. When you hit the end of the slack, the kinetic energy should... Ma'am? Brennan was beside her again. Always beside her, like a conscience she hadn't asked for. The approach angle is too steep. If the stuck truck doesn't move, the recovery truck is going to... I've calculated the vectors, Sergeant. Yes, ma'am. But mud doesn't care about vectors. She looked at him, he looked back, and for a moment Reese saw something in his eyes that made her chest tight. Pity. He pitied her. Execute, she said. The recovery truck's engine roared. Diesel smoke poured into the rain. The vehicle lurched forward, tires churning, eating up the slack in the kinetic rope. 40 feet, 30, 20. The rope went taut, stretched. The recovery truck kept accelerating. The kinetic energy building, ready to release. The stuck HEMTT didn't budge. The recovery truck hit the end of the rope like hitting a wall. The entire vehicle bounced backward. The rope recoiled. The stuck truck settled another 2 inches deeper into the clay. Silence, just the rain, the idling engines, Reese's heartbeat in her ears. Get the snatch block, she said quietly. Ma'am, get the snatch block. Each word separate, final. Brennan retrieved the snatch block from the equipment bay. A massive pulley system designed to double the pulling force by changing the angle of the cable. Complex, beautiful in its way, the kind of solution that looked good on paper. They rigged it to a tree, ran the cable through, created a 2-to-1 mechanical advantage that should theoretically generate enough force to pull the truck free. Should. Sergeant Brennan, Reese said, her voice was steadier now. She'd found her command tone again. I need you to monitor the load. If we exceed, Lieutenant. Brennan's voice was flat, hard, the kind of tone sergeants used when they were done being polite. That cable can't take this load. Not at this angle. Not with the friction from the block. It's going to, That's an order, Sergeant. He stared at her. She stared back. The rain fell between them. Yes, ma'am, he finally said. They engaged the winch on the recovery vehicle. The motor whined. The cable went taut. The snatch block groaned as steel ran through steel. The tree they'd anchored to began to creak. The cable was vibrating. Reese could see it, a high-frequency buzz that made the air around it shimmer. Physics in motion, potential energy building toward kinetic release. Hold, she called out. Check the digital load meter. We're at 85% capacity. The specs say crack. The cable snapped. Not at the connection point, not at a weak spot. Right in the middle where the steel had been bent through the snatch block at an impossible angle where microscopic fractures had formed and propagated and finally catastrophically failed. The cable whipped through the air, slashed through the rain, missed Colt Merrick's head by 3 inches and embedded itself in the pine tree with the sound of a gunshot. And Reese felt something inside her break. Something that had nothing to do with steel or physics or engineering. She sat down in the mud. Didn't mean to, her legs just stopped working. She sat down right there in the brown slurry, rain hammering her helmet, and put her head in her hands. 24 years old, top of her class, Daddy's little girl who was going to show everyone that she was just as good as he was. Better, maybe. Going to make colonel by 35. Going to command a battalion. Going to make him proud. She'd nearly killed a kid. Ma'am, Brennan's hand on her shoulder, heavy, warm through the wet uniform. We need to call for a heavy recovery vehicle. There's no shame in... My father died because he was too proud to ask for help. The words came out before she could stop them. Training exercise. Winter conditions. Senior NCO told him to check the ice thickness before driving across. Dad said he knew better. He had the calculations. The vehicle went through. 3 men drowned, Dad included. Brennan was quiet for a long moment. I know, ma'am. I read the report. Of course he had. Everybody had. Captain Daniel Callahan, MIT graduate, brilliant mind, dead at 42 because he'd been too smart to listen to a sergeant with 30 years of experience who knew that ICE doesn't care about calculations. I'm making the same mistake, Reese said. Aren't I? Brennan squeezed her shoulder once, then let go. You're learning, ma'am. That's different than not learning. She looked up at him. At this man who'd been trying to save her from herself all day. We can't wait for heavy recovery. Those patients, I know, we're out of options. Yes, ma'am, we are. They sat there in the rain. The stuck truck mocked them. The broken cable swayed in the wind. And somewhere 12 people were breathing on battery power that was slowly inevitably running down. The old man appeared like something from a story. One minute the tree line was empty, the next he was there. He was wearing a yellow rain slicker that looked like it had been purchased from a hardware store sometime during the Reagan administration. He had a thermos in one hand and a walking cane in the other. His face was weathered leather, deep lines, sunspots, the kind of skin you get from spending nearly 80 years outside in the weather. He was watching them, just standing at the fence line, leaning on that cane, watching these young soldiers scramble in the mud like ants in a rainstorm. Reese saw him and felt a flash of irritation cut through her despair. A civilian on a military installation during an operation. Hey, she got to her feet, mud sloughing off her uniform. This is a restricted area. You need to clear out, now. The old man didn't move, just took a slow sip from his thermos. Steam rose from the cup, coffee probably, hot coffee, while she stood here, soaking wet and freezing, and watching her career circle the drain. Sir, she called again, louder. This is dangerous. We just had a cable failure. You need to... He started walking toward them, slow, careful, picking his way down the muddy embankment with the measured steps of someone who knew exactly how much his joints hurt and how little he could afford to fall. Reese started toward him. Sir, I'm ordering you to... You're going to tear the transmission out of that recovery vehicle. His voice was deep, gravelly, surprisingly loud. It cut through the sound of the rain and the idling engines like a knife through paper. Reese stopped. Excuse me? He reached level ground and walked to within 10 feet of the stuck HEMTT. Looked at it, looked at the buried wheels, looked at the broken cable still swaying from the tree. That cable snapped because you were pulling against the suction, he said. Matter of fact, like he was commenting on the weather. You can't pull a dead weight out of a vacuum. You have to lift it. Brennan had moved up beside Reese. She could feel him watching this interaction with the kind of attention you give to a grenade with a loose pin. Sir, Reese said, tried to keep her voice level, professional. I appreciate your concern, but I'm a mechanical engineer. I understand the physics. We're dealing with a friction coefficient that requires more horsepower than... The old man laughed. It was a dry, rasping sound, like sandpaper on wood. Horsepower isn't your problem, young lady. He pointed his cane at the spinning rear wheels. Traction is, right now your wheels are just icing a cake. You keep spinning them, you're just polishing the mud. I don't have time for this. Reese turned to Brennan. Get him off the site. We need to, Your belly hung, the old man continued, ignoring her. The differentials are dragging. You pull it forward, you're just plowing earth. You need to make the truck climb. Reese threw her hands up. Water flew from her fingers. Climb what? There's nothing under the tires but 6 feet of liquid clay. The old man turned, looked at her for the first time, really looked. His eyes were pale blue, the kind of blue you see in winter skies. And they were sharp, sharper than any 79-year-old's eyes had a right to be. I see a pile of windfall timber over there. He pointed his cane toward the tree line. Pine logs, maybe 8 inches thick. The cane swung back toward the truck. And I see you've got heavy-duty transport chains on the back of that vehicle. So, Reese heard the hostility in her own voice. Didn't care. So, the old man said, why don't you stop trying to tow it and let the truck walk itself out? Silence. Brennan looked at the old man, looked at Reese. Walk it out. What's he talking about? The old man stepped closer. He looked at the massive tires of the HEMTT, studied them like an artist studying a canvas. It's called an unditching beam, he said. Or if you knew the man who made it famous, the Patton twist. Reese felt something shift in her chest. Patton, as in General Patton, Third Army. The old man's voice had changed, gotten quieter, heavier. My father was Red Ball Express, drove supplies to the front lines in 1944, 24 hours a day. Ardennes forest, mud deeper than this, snow on top, Germans strafing the roads. They didn't have tow trucks. They didn't have time to wait. You got stuck, you got dead. So they learned. He looked back at her. My name is Grit Ashford, Master Sergeant retired, 42 years of service. And I know this truck isn't a World War II deuce-and-a-half lieutenant, but the physics haven't changed since 1944. Gravity is still gravity. Mud is still mud. The rain pattered against their helmets, against the hood of the truck, against the surface of the standing water that reflected the gray sky. You're telling me, Reese said slowly, that you can get this truck out with logs and chains. I'm telling you my father could. I've done it 47 times in 40 years, and I can teach you how. In how long? 10 minutes. He looked at his watch. Old, analog, the kind with hands, give or take depending on how fast your people can swing a sledgehammer. Reese looked at Brennan. Brennan looked back. She could see the question in his eyes. The same question that was in her own mind. What do we have to lose? Everything, a voice whispered. If this doesn't work, you've wasted time. Those patience. But nothing else had worked. The winch was dead. The kinetic rope had failed. The snatch block had nearly killed someone. And this old man was standing here in the rain, calm as Sunday morning, talking about logs and chains and techniques from a war that ended before she was born. 10 minutes, she said. It wasn't a question. Give or take. Reese let out a long breath, felt it leave her body like steam from a pressure valve. All right, she said. What do we do? Something shifted in Grit Ashford's posture. He straightened up. The cane went from support to baton, and when he spoke again, the voice wasn't that of an old man sharing stories. It was the voice of a master sergeant who'd spent 4 decades teaching soldiers how to survive. You, he pointed the cane at Brennan, take Merrick, go to that wood line. I need 2 logs. Pine. Green if you can find it, but solid. 8 feet long, thick enough to stand on without cracking. Brennan looked at Reese. She nodded. You. The cane swung to Merrick, who was still standing by the recovery vehicle looking like he'd seen a ghost. Get the chains. I need 2 binders and 2 20-foot lengths. Move. Merrick moved. And you. Grit looked at Reese. Get your driver in the cab. Tell him to lock the differentials, all of them. Low range. The authority in his voice was absolute. It wasn't the yelling of a drill sergeant. It wasn't the bark of an officer giving orders. It was something else. Something older. The calm command of a man who had solved this exact problem when bullets were flying and blood was running, and the difference between right and wrong meant the difference between living and dying. Reese found herself moving before she'd consciously decided to obey. Found herself climbing into the cab of the HEMTT, water pouring from her uniform. Found herself engaging the differential locks with hands that had stopped shaking. Through the windshield, she watched Brennan and Merrick return from the tree line dragging 2 heavy pine logs. Watched them lay the logs beside the rear wheels under Grit's direction. Watched the old man wade into the mud without hesitation, without complaint, like the brown slurry was just another inconvenience in a life full of inconveniences. Here's the lesson, Grit called out. His voice carried over the rain. Pay attention. I'm only going to show you once. He used his cane to point. Place the log perpendicular to the tire, across the tread, right on top. Brennan and Merrick lifted the heavy pine log, laid it across the 2 rear tires. It sat there like a bridge between them. Now Grit said, feed the chain through the rim, loop it around the log. Tight. Use the binder. You want that log married to the wheel. It has to become part of the tire. They worked. The chain rattled. The binder clicked into place with a sound like a ratchet. Reese watched from the cab, watched Grit direct them with his cane like a conductor with a baton. And slowly, very slowly, her engineering brain began to understand. I see, she whispered to herself. It's a paddle wheel. It's not a paddle wheel. Grit's voice somehow cut through the glass and the rain and her own thoughts. It's a leg. When that wheel turns, the log is going to catch the ground. Since the log can't slide, the wheel has to go up and over it. You're artificially increasing the radius of the wheel and creating a solid contact point with the substrate. He looked up at her through the rain-streaked windshield. But the fender, Reese started. That's why you only go forward 3 feet. The log lifts you up out of the hole. Once you're on top of the log, you're high enough to clear the suction. Then you unchain it, reset if you need to, and do it again. But usually 1 bite is enough to get momentum. It looked ridiculous. It looked like something from a cartoon. A Flintstone solution applied to a $500,000 war machine. Logs and chains, wood and iron. The kind of thing you'd see in a museum labeled how they did it in the old days. But the physics were sound. Driver, Grit's voice boomed. He didn't use a radio, didn't need one. Listen to me, when I signal you give it steady throttle. Do not floor it. If you spin the log, we'll tear the brake lines out. You let the torque do the work. Creep it, you understand? Through the mirror, Reese saw Merrick nod, his face pale. Everyone clear, Brennan ordered. If that chain snaps, it won't snap, Grit said quietly, confidently. Not if she creeps it. He stood 10 feet to the side, raised his cane, and looked at Reese through the windshield, those pale blue eyes locked with hers. 6 stories, Lieutenant, he said. My father's first, Lebanon, Somalia, Iraq, Afghanistan, 60 years of getting unstuck. You want to hear them, you do this right. You want to keep making the same mistakes your whole career. You keep trying to muscle through problems instead of thinking around them. His cane came down, pointed forward. Go. Reese's foot found the accelerator, pressed down, gentle, steady, the way you'd press on a baby's head to feel the soft spot. The engine note changed, deepened. The wheels began to turn. Clunk. The chain took up the slack. Crunch. The log rotated down, bit into the mud. And for one impossible second, the entire 16-ton truck groaned. The chassis twisted. The metal screamed. It looked like the log was going to snap like a toothpick. But then physics took over. The log acted as a solid anchor. The wheel couldn't slip. It had to climb. And slowly, majestically, the rear of the truck began to rise. It lifted, rose up out of the sucking clay like a whale breaching. The log forced the truck forward and upward. The front wheels, freed from the drag of the buried rear end, suddenly found purchase on the edge of the road. Keep it coming, Grit yelled, waved his cane. Steady, steady. The truck surged. The logs rotated under the tires, provided a temporary bridge over the abyss, gave the wheels something solid to grip, to push against, to climb. Stop! Reese slammed the brakes. The truck rocked, settled, and she looked out the window, hardly daring to breathe. The HEMTT was out of the hole, sitting on the solid shoulder of the road, mud dripping from the undercarriage, but free, completely, impossibly free. The silence that followed was total, or maybe it just felt total because the roaring in Reese's ears had stopped. The panic, the fear, the certainty of failure. She climbed down from the cab. Her boots hit solid ground, and she just stood there staring at the truck that 10 minutes ago had been hopelessly stuck and was now ready to roll. I don't, Brennan's voice was hoarse. I don't believe it. Did you feel that? Merrick was grinning like a lunatic. It just walked out, like it had legs. Reese walked to Grit Ashford. He was scraping mud off his boots with his cane, looking for all the world like this was the most normal thing he'd done all week. That was, she stopped, started again. That was brilliant. I've never seen that in any manual. Grit smiled, wiped a raindrop from his nose. They don't put it in the manuals anymore because they assume you'll always have a recovery vehicle. Assume you'll always have the perfect equipment, the perfect conditions. He looked at her, but my father taught me something. Actually, he wrote it down in a journal before he died, before I was born even. He wrote, you fight with what you have, not what you wish you had. Your father was Red Ball Express, Reese asked. He was there in 1944. Private First Class James Ashford died in a training accident in January 1946, 3 months after I was born. I never met him, but I read his journal. He wrote down everything, every trick, every lesson, including this one, including the day General Patton himself taught it to them when a Sherman tank got stuck and German artillery was zeroing in. Grit's voice had gone soft, distant, like he was seeing something 70 years away. My father learned it from Patton. I learned it from my father's words. And I've taught it to 47 soldiers in 42 years of service. You're number 48, Lieutenant. He looked at the high-tech truck, at the computer systems and hydraulic assists and all the modern engineering that hadn't been enough. Fancy machine you got there, he said, but it still needs a driver who understands that the ground always wins if you fight it straight on. You have to work with it, dance with it, respect it. Reese nodded slowly. The arrogance that had filled her chest 6 hours ago was gone. The certainty, the pride, all of it washed away in the rain and the mud and the sight of a 16-ton truck, walking out of a hole on nothing but leash and chains and knowledge from a war before her father was born. The patent twist, she said. I'll remember that. You do that, Grit said. He looked at the broken cable still hanging from the tree. And maybe teach your people how to splice a cable properly while you're at it. That snap nearly took the boy's head off. He adjusted his rain slicker, checked his watch. Now I'm late for lunch. My daughter's expecting me. He started to turn away. Wait, the word burst from Reese before she could stop it. Wait, you're just going to leave. You're not going to... I mean, we still have to get to the FOB. What if we get stuck again? What if, Grit paused, turned back, and for the first time since he'd appeared, he smiled. A real smile, the kind that reached his eyes. What if, he repeated, what if the world ends? What if the sun doesn't rise? What if pigs fly? He shook his head. Lieutenant, I just taught you how to solve a problem that's stumped armies for 100 years. I don't need to hold your hand the rest of the way. You're smart. You'll figure it out. But how do you know? How do you know we won't? Because, Grit said, and his voice had changed again, had that sergeant's tone that cut through bullshit like a laser through paper. You're not the same person you were 10 minutes ago. 10 minutes ago, you thought you had all the answers. Now you know you don't. That makes you dangerous, Lieutenant. In a good way. He touched his cane to his forehead, a casual salute, then turned and started walking back up the embankment. Sergeant Major, Reese called after him. I don't even know how to thank you. He stopped, didn't turn around, just called back over his shoulder. 6 stories, Lieutenant. That's how you thank me. Ask me about the 6 stories. What 6 stories? Now he did turn, stood on the embankment in the rain, this 79-year-old man who just saved her career, her mission, and maybe 12 lives at a field hospital she'd never seen. The 6 times I used this method when it mattered, he said, when people were dying, when the mission was on the line, when the easy way wasn't available and the hard way was the only way. He tapped his temple with one finger. They're up here, every detail, every lesson. My father's first story from 1944, Lebanon 1965, Somalia 1993, Iraq 2003, Afghanistan 2008, and today, 2024. 6 stories across 80 years. Each one taught me something. Each one kept people alive. The rain fell between them. Reese stood there mud-covered and humbled, looking up at this old man who'd appeared like something from a fairy tale and solved the unsolvable. Will you tell me, she asked quietly. Maybe, Grit said. If you ask nicely, if you're willing to listen. Really listen. Not just hear the words, but understand what they cost. I'm listening. Are you? She nodded. Yes, sir, I'm listening. Grit was quiet for a long moment, studying her, measuring her, and then he nodded just once. All right then, he said. Let's get this truck moving. You've got people waiting on those generators. And while we drive, I'll tell you a story. The first story, about a young private who learned the patent twist in the snow and the mud and the blood of the Ardennes forest. A young private who wrote it all down in a journal so his son, a son he'd never meet, would know how to survive. He started walking back down the embankment. Come on, Lieutenant. Time and tide wait for no one, and neither do dying patients. Reese looked at Brennan, at Merrick, at the truck that was free, at the mission that was still alive. Mount up, she said. We've got a convoy to finish. And as they climbed into their vehicles, as the engines roared to life and the wheels began to turn on solid ground, Reese Callahan understood something that no classroom at MIT had ever taught her. Knowledge isn't just what you know, it's what you're willing to learn. And sometimes the best teachers are the ones you never expected to meet. The convoy rolled through the rain at 20 miles per hour. Not fast, but steady. The kind of steady that comes from knowing you've already faced the worst and survived it. Reese sat in the passenger seat of the lead HEMTT. Grit Ashford sat beside her in the driver's position, his weathered hands on the wheel, driving like he'd been born doing it, which in a way he had. The old man moved with the vehicle like it was an extension of himself. Every shift of weight, every adjustment to the steering. Smooth, economical, perfect. Behind them, Brennan drove the recovery vehicle. Merrick brought up the rear, 3 trucks in a line carrying generators that would keep 12 people breathing. The radio crackled. Brennan's voice. Ma'am, how much time do we have? Reese checked her watch. 2 hours, 15 minutes. We'll make it, Grit said. Didn't look at her. Kept his eyes on the muddy road ahead. We've got clear road from here. 15 miles, even at this speed, we'll make it with time to spare. How do you know the road is clear? Because I walk these trails every day. Have for 6 years since I retired and moved back here. I know every mile of this installation better than I know my own face in the mirror. Reese studied him, the deep lines around his eyes, the weathered skin, the hands that gripped the wheel with surprising strength. 79 years old and still steady as granite. You said you'd tell me a story, she said quietly. I did say that. The first story, about your father. Grit was silent for a moment. The wipers swept across the windshield. Swept back, swept across. A rhythm like breathing. My father, he finally said, died 3 months after I was born. Training accident, January 1946. The war was over. He'd survived 4 years of combat, survived the Bulge, survived Bastonia, survived things that killed better men. And then he died on a frozen lake in Georgia because an officer didn't listen when a sergeant told him to check the ice. Reese felt her chest tighten. Like my father. Yes, ma'am, like your father. Grit glanced at her. Which is why I'm here. Why I walked down that embankment all day instead of going home to my daughter's cooking. Because I know what it looks like when pride is about to kill someone. And I've seen enough death. He shifted gears. The truck responded smoothly. My father left behind a journal, Grit continued. Leather-bound thing, about this big. He held up one hand showing a space roughly 6 inches by 9. He'd started it in basic training, kept it all through the war, wrote in it every night he could, observations, lessons, things he wanted to remember, things he wanted to teach. He knew he might die. Every soldier knows that, Lieutenant. The good ones prepare for it, make sure something survives them. Grit's voice had gone distant, like he was reading from a book written in his memory. Story 1, he said, December 1944, the Ardennes Forest. Let me tell you about the day my father learned the patent twist from the man himself. The windshield wipers became the sound of tank tracks in snow. The rain became sleet. And Grit's voice carried Reese across 80 years to a forest in Belgium where men were dying in the cold. My father was 26 years old, Private First Class James Ashford, Red Ball Express. They were truck drivers, but they were more than that. They were the lifeline, the artery. Every bullet fired on the front lines came through them. Every can of beans, every gallon of fuel, every bandage. 24 hours a day they drove. The Germans knew it, strafed them, bombed them, shelled them. Reese could see it, could picture it. Young James Ashford behind the wheel of a deuce-and-a-half Knuckles, white on the steering wheel, eyes scanning the sky for fighters. December 17th, 1944. Grit continued. The Germans launched their last big offensive, punched through the American lines, surrounded Bastonia, cut the supply routes, and the Third Army got the order to turn north, relieve the siege, save the men who were trapped. Your father was part of that. He was driving ammunition, 2 tons of artillery shells, following a Sherman tank that was leading a column of supply trucks through a forest road that hadn't been cleared. Snow on the ground, mud underneath, and the Sherman hit a soft spot. Grit's hands tightened on the wheel, like he was gripping that other wheel that other time. The tank went in up to the sponsons, belly hung, tracks spinning, going nowhere, and the column stopped. Right there in the open, the tank commander was screaming, panicking. They could hear the German artillery starting to range in, hear the shells walking closer. Crump, 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 getting nearer. What did they do? The tank commander wanted to abandon the tank, save the crew. My father wrote that the man was young, a lieutenant, fresh from the States, probably 22, 23 years old. He'd calculated that they couldn't recover the tank. Not in time. The math said it was impossible. Reese felt something twist in her stomach, recognized herself in that description. And then, Grit said, and his voice changed, got quieter, heavier with reverence. General George S. Patton showed up. Patton himself, in a Jeep, 3 stars on his helmet, pearl-handled pistols on his belt. He took one look at that stuck tank and said, my father wrote down the exact words, son, you're not abandoning a 30-ton tank because you're scared of a little mud and some German fireworks. Grit smiled at this memory he'd never lived but had inherited. Patton called for logs and chains. The tank crew didn't understand. The lieutenant started to argue, started to explain the physics, the coefficient of friction, the weight-to-traction ratio, all the math that said it couldn't be done. What did Patton say? He said, Lieutenant, I don't give a damn about your math. I give a damn about that tank. Now get me 2 logs and shut your mouth. The rain hammered harder. Grit's voice rose to match it. They found logs, pine trees that had been shelled down, 8 inches thick. They chained them to the tracks. Perpendicular, just like we did today. And Patton himself directed it. Stood there in the snow with German shells landing close enough to throw frozen dirt on his boots, and he directed those men like he was conducting an orchestra. Did it work? The tank driver engaged the clutch, gave it throttle. The logs rotated down, bit into the frozen mud underneath the snow, and that Sherman climbed, lifted itself out of the hole like it was climbing stairs, 30 tons of steel walking on wooden legs. Grit's voice had gone reverent, almost worshipful. My father wrote that he stood there watching, and it was like seeing a miracle. The tank came up out of that hole, the logs gave it purchase, and it rolled forward onto solid ground. The whole thing took 4 minutes. 4 minutes. And Patton turned to the lieutenant and said, "That's how you fight a war, son, with what you have, not with what you wish you had." Reese was quiet, watching the rain, seeing snow instead, seeing a 3-star general in a frozen forest teaching young men how to survive. My father wrote it all down that night, Grit said, drew diagrams, wrote the measurements, the angle of the logs, the placement of the chains, the rate of throttle, everything. He titled it The Patton Twist. And he wrote, "If I die tomorrow, whoever reads this needs to know this. It will save lives." And 3 months later, he died. 3 months later, he died on a frozen lake because an officer didn't listen to a sergeant who said, "Check the ice." My father's last act was pushing 2 other men out of the sinking truck before it went under, saved them, drowned himself. Grit's voice had gone flat, emotionless. The kind of tone you use when emotion would break you. I was 3 months old, never knew him. But when I turned 18, my mother gave me that journal, said he'd wanted me to have it, wanted me to learn from it, and I did. I read every word, studied every diagram, and the first time I got stuck in basic training, I tried it. Logs and chains, the Patton twist, and it worked. He looked at Reese, those pale blue eyes finding hers. That was 1963. I was 18 years old, and I've used it 47 times since then, taught it to 47 soldiers. You're 48, and every single time I teach it, every single time someone learns it and survives because of it, my father's death means something. His words live on. That's legacy, Lieutenant. That's what survives us. Reese felt tears prick her eyes, blinked them back. "Your father saved lives before you were born," she said quietly. "Yes, ma'am, and he's still saving them. Through me, through you now, through everyone who learns this and passes it on. Knowledge is the only thing that's truly immortal." The truck rolled on through the rain, and Reese understood that she wasn't just learning a technique. She was becoming part of a chain that stretched back 80 years to a frozen forest in Belgium, part of something bigger than herself. "Story 2, Grit said. "If you're ready." "I'm ready." Grit adjusted his grip on the wheel. The road ahead was curving. He took it smooth, easy, like he'd driven it 1,000 times. 1965, he said. "I was 20 years old. Sergeant, Marine Corps, Operation Power Pack. You probably haven't heard of it." "I haven't." "Most people haven't. It was short, dirty, the kind of intervention that doesn't make the history books because we'd rather forget we were there. Civil War in the Dominican Republic. We went in to evacuate American civilians and stabilize the situation, which is military talk for point guns at people until they stop shooting each other." He smiled without humor. "I was with a motor transport company, driving supplies into Santo Domingo, and the island was in monsoon season. You think this rain is bad?" He gestured at the windshield. "This is a drizzle. Down there, the rain comes down like God is dumping buckets. And the mud." His voice took on a different quality, darker. "The mud in the tropics isn't like mud here. It's different. The soil is different, volcanic, heavy with minerals, clay content that's off the charts. It doesn't just get slippery, it becomes liquid. Moving liquid. We called it sopa de barro. Mud soup. Sounds terrible. It was terrible. We lost more vehicles to mud than we did to enemy action. And the first time I really encountered it, I had a truck stuck in it, 5-ton, carrying medical supplies into a forward aid station. And we had a deadline. There were wounded men waiting for those supplies." Reese leaned forward. The story was pulling her in. She could feel the heat of the Caribbean, smell the rain on volcanic soil. "There was an engineer with us," Grit continued. "Lieutenant, young guy, smart. He had all the equipment, digital load calculator. This was 1965, so digital meant the size of a typewriter. But it was cutting edge. He could input the weight of the vehicle, the estimated coefficient of friction, the soil density. Punch out an answer. What did his calculator say? It said we needed a wrecker with at least 8 tons of pulling force. Problem was, We didn't have a wrecker. We had two other trucks, some chains, and about 30 minutes before those wounded men started dying. Grit shifted down as they approached a steeper section of road. The engine note changed, steady, controlled. The lieutenant wanted to wait, call for proper recovery. He had the numbers. He had the math. And the math said anything else was impossible. But you didn't wait. I'd read my father's journal 40 times by then, could quote it from memory, and I knew something that calculator didn't know. I knew that volcanic mud and temperate clay aren't the same. The friction coefficients are different. The suction dynamics are different. You can't just plug in numbers and get truth. You have to look, really look. He tapped the side of his head. I walked around that truck, looked at the mud, saw how it moved, how it held the tire, how it reflected light, and I knew what kind of log we needed, not pine. Pine is too soft for volcanic mud. It would compress. You need hardwood, something dense. What did you use? Mahogany. Found a fallen mahogany tree about 200 yards into the jungle. We cut two logs, heavier than pine, denser, and the diameter was different too. Volcanic mud has higher suction, so you need a thicker log to get the leverage. His voice took on the rhythm of teaching, of a man who'd explained this 100 times. The lieutenant told me I was wrong, showed me his calculator, showed me the numbers, said the mahogany would be too heavy, would create too much friction. The math said it wouldn't work. But it did work. It worked. We chained those mahogany logs to the rear axle. I got behind the wheel, gave it smooth throttle, and that 5-ton truck walked out of that mud like it was strolling down a sidewalk. 4 minutes, the lieutenant stood there with his mouth open. Couldn't believe it. His calculator couldn't compute what his eyes were seeing. Grit glanced at her. You know what he said to me? What? He said, "How did you know?" And I told him, "I didn't calculate it, sir. I observed it. There's a difference." Reese felt something click in her mind, like a puzzle piece falling into place. "You were looking at mud on the iPad," she said, "back at the stuck truck, before you arrived. I was checking soil density readings. And what were the readings telling you? They were giving me averages, regional averages, not specific to that exact location." Exactly. Instruments tell you generalizations. Your eyes tell you specifics. And in the field, specifics matter. A calculator can tell you the average coefficient of friction for Georgia clay, but it can't tell you that this particular patch of Georgia clay has 20% more water content because it's at the bottom of a drainage slope. It can't tell you that the clay layer is only 4 feet deep here, but 6 feet deep 10 yards over. It can't see. He tapped the windshield. But you can, if you train yourself to look, really look, not just see but observe. That's what I learned in the Dominican Republic. That's what saved those wounded men. Observation over calculation. The rain began to ease, just slightly. The clouds were still heavy, but there were breaks, patches of lighter gray. The lieutenant's truck, Grit said, got stuck 2 days later. Same road, different spot. He tried to use the calculator again, tried to do everything by the numbers. His truck sat there for 6 hours before a wrecker finally arrived. 6 hours. And yours? Mine got stuck 3 more times during that deployment. Each time I walked around, looked at the mud, chose the right logs, right diameter, right wood, and each time we were moving again in under 10 minutes. He smiled, a real smile this time. The lieutenant eventually asked me to teach him, sat down with my father's journal, studied it, started training his eyes instead of trusting his calculator. Smart kid, he learned. That's the difference between being educated and being wise, Lieutenant. Education is what they give you in school. Wisdom is what you earn in the mud. Reese looked down at her own hands, thought about the iPad she'd been consulting, the calculations she'd trusted, the numbers that had told her she was right, even as the cable snapped and nearly killed Merrick. "I was that, Lieutenant," she said quietly. "Yes, ma'am, you were. I trusted the numbers over my own eyes." "Yes, ma'am. I was wrong." Grit reached over and patted her shoulder. Once, gentle, the way a father might. "Being wrong is fine," he said. "Staying wrong is what kills you. You learned today. That makes you dangerous. In a good way." He pulled his hand back, put it on the wheel. "Story 3, he said. "This one's harder. This one costs something." Reese looked at him, saw the way his jaw tightened, saw something flicker behind those pale blue eyes. "You don't have to tell it," she said. "Yes, ma'am, I do. Because this is the one about pride, and you need to hear it." The rain had stopped. The road was still wet, but the storm had passed. Ahead, the sky was clearing, but Grit's voice was darker than the clouds had been. Mogadishu, he said. The word came out like a curse. October 1993. You know what happened in there. Black Hawk Down. That's the movie version. The real version was uglier, messier. We went in thinking we were peacekeepers. Found out real quick that the people we were keeping peace from didn't want peace. They wanted us dead. He was quiet for a moment. The truck hummed. The tires sang against wet asphalt. I was 48 years old, Master Sergeant. I'd been in for 30 years. I was supposed to be training, not fighting. But Mogadishu didn't care about supposed to. It cared about who could shoot and who could drive and who could keep young men alive when everything went to hell. Reese heard the change in his voice. The weight. This wasn't a story about techniques and logs. This was about something else. Something that still hurt. There was a ranger, Grit said. Young lieutenant, 24 years old, about your age actually, fresh out of West Point, top of his class, smart as hell, could calculate firing solutions in his head, could quote field manuals chapter and verse, could do things with a rifle that made grown men weep. What was his name? Doesn't matter, he's dead. They're all dead if you go back far enough. Grit's voice was flat. He was assigned to me for vehicle recovery training. 3 days. I was supposed to teach him and his squad basic recovery procedures before they went operational. Did he listen? No, ma'am, he did not. The truck rolled on. Grit's hands gripped the wheel tighter. First day I showed them the patent twist, showed them logs and chains, showed them how to read the ground. And this lieutenant, he laughed, actually laughed, said, and I quote, "Sergeant, we have modern recovery vehicles. We have winches. We have hydraulics. We don't need logs." What did you say? I said, what happens when the recovery vehicle gets stuck? What happens when the winch breaks? What happens when you're 10 miles from support and you've got wounded men in the truck and the enemy is closing in? And he said, that's why we plan properly, Sergeant. So those situations don't occur. Grit's laugh was bitter, sharp. Plan properly, like the enemy gives a damn about your plans. He took a breath, let it out slow. 2 weeks later, his unit got hit. Ambush on the west bank from a patrol. Humvee took an RPG. Didn't destroy it, but damaged the axle. Couldn't drive. And they were in a bad part of the city. Bakara Market. You couldn't hold that ground, not for long. They called for recovery. What happened? The recovery Humvee came, tried to tow them, but the street was narrow. The angle was wrong, and the damaged Humvee was heavy. Dead weight. The recovery vehicle's winch motor burned out, just like ours did today. Just like I told that lieutenant would happen if he didn't have a backup plan. Reese felt her stomach tighten. They were stuck, both vehicles, and the militia was closing in. You could hear the gunfire getting louder, closer, and that young lieutenant he got on the radio called for a heavy wrecker. By the book. Proper procedure. Wait for the right equipment. But you were there. I was 5 blocks away, heard the radio traffic, grabbed my gear and a couple of Marines and we ran. Ran through streets where people were shooting at us. Ran because I knew. I knew what was going to happen if we waited for that wrecker. His voice cracked, just slightly. By the time we got there, the lieutenant was screaming into the radio. The wrecker was stuck in traffic, ambushed, couldn't get through, and the militia was 2 blocks away, coming fast. The lieutenant had 8 men, 2 wounded, and no way to move. What did you do? I did what my father would have done. What Patton would have done. I found logs, tore them off a bombed-out building, found chains in the damaged Humvee's equipment bay, and I rigged that vehicle for the Patton twist while bullets were cracking past my head. His hands were white on the wheel now. The lieutenant told me to stop, said I was wasting time, said we needed to wait for proper equipment. And I told him, I said, Lieutenant, those men shooting at us don't care about proper equipment. You can follow the book and die, or you can trust me and live. Your choice. Did he listen? He watched, that's all. Just watched while I chained those logs to the Humvee's wheels. Watched while I got behind the wheel and gave it throttle. Watched while that damaged vehicle climbed up on those logs and rolled forward, freed itself, started moving. Grit's voice went quiet. We got out, all of us. Drove those 2 Humvees back to the base. Took fire the whole way. Lost 2 side mirrors and a windshield. But we made it. Everyone lived. Reese waited. There was more. She could feel it. The wrecker they'd called for, Grit said softly. It got ambushed hard, real hard. 2 crew killed, driver and gunner. They died waiting to rescue that lieutenant because the lieutenant wouldn't trust a method that was 80 years old. Wouldn't trust logs and chains because it wasn't in the manual. Silence filled the cab, heavy, thick. The lieutenant came to me that night, Grit continued. Found me in the motor pool, and he broke down, completely broke down. Cried, said it was his fault, said he killed those men because he was too proud to listen. What did you tell him? I told him what my father would have told him. I said, you didn't kill them, Lieutenant. Pride did. But now you have a choice. You can carry that pride to your grave, or you can kill it right here, right now, and make sure nobody else dies because of it. Grit's voice was hoarse now. I told him about my father. Told him how he died because an officer was too proud to listen to a sergeant who said, check the ice. Told him that I'd spent my whole life making sure my father's death meant something, making sure nobody else died from pride if I could prevent it. He paused, then added something that wasn't in the original outline, something that made the twist deeper. And I told him something else, something I've never told another soul until today. Reese held her breath. I told him that I'd been tracking your career, Lieutenant Callahan, that when I read the report about your father's death 5 years ago, when I saw that Captain Daniel Callahan had a daughter who'd just been accepted to MIT, I made a promise. I promised that if I ever had the chance, I would save her from becoming her father. I would teach her what he never learned. Humility over pride. Reese's eyes went wide. You've been watching me for 6 years, ma'am, since you graduated. I moved back to Georgia when I heard you'd been assigned to Fort Benning. I walk these trails every day waiting for the moment when you'd need what I have to teach. When I heard your engines this morning, when I heard that winch burning out, I knew. This was the moment. This was why I've been here. Tears streamed down Reese's face. You knew about my father. You knew about me. And you still... I couldn't let it happen again, Grit said simply. Your father died from pride. That lieutenant in Somalia learned from his mistake and taught 60 Rangers before he was killed in Iraq. And you, Lieutenant Callahan, you're going to teach hundreds, maybe thousands. Because today pride died and humility lived. The FOB was visible now, 10 minutes away, but Reese couldn't speak, could only cry. Because this old man had spent 6 years waiting to save her. 6 years carrying the weight of her father's death and his own father's death and all the deaths that pride had caused. Story 4, Grit said gently. If you can hear it, this one's about hope. Reese wiped her eyes, nodded. Tell me. Iraq, Grit said, 2003. I was 58 years old. Way too old to be in a combat zone if you ask anyone with common sense. But the Marine Corps doesn't run on common sense. It runs on need, and they needed people who knew how to keep vehicles moving in sand. The truck rolled closer to the FOB. The lights were getting brighter. I was an advisor, attached to a maintenance company, all female, first generation of women doing heavy mechanical work in a combat zone, and the male soldiers didn't like it. Reese felt something tighten in her chest. She knew this story, had lived versions of it. There was a staff sergeant, Grit continued. Name was Diana Price, 32 years old, built like a fire hydrant, could bench press 200 pounds and take apart a diesel engine blindfolded. Best mechanic I ever worked with. Male or female. Didn't matter. She was just the best. What happened? The male soldiers made bets, said the women couldn't handle real recovery work, said they'd fold the first time things got hard. And there was this one sergeant, real piece of work, who made a specific bet, said if the women could recover a stuck MRAP using field expedient methods, he'd buy the whole company stakes. But if they failed, they had to admit they didn't belong. Grit's voice held an edge of anger. Old anger, the kind that never really goes away. Price came to me, asked me to teach them everything I knew, said she didn't care about the bet, didn't care about the stakes. She cared about proving that competence isn't about what's between your legs. It's about what's between your ears. Did you teach them? I taught them, spent 2 weeks going over my father's journal with them, showed them the patent twist, showed them how to read ground, how to choose lungs, how to rig chains. They were good students, better than good. They asked questions I'd never thought about, challenged assumptions I'd had for 40 years. He shifted gears as they approached the FOB entrance. 3 weeks into the deployment, we got the call. MRAP stuck in Anbar province, sandstorm, middle of nowhere, and the male soldiers were watching, waiting for the women to fail. What did they do? They executed. Perfect. Price led the team. They found lumber from a destroyed building, cut it to length. But here's where it got interesting. They didn't just copy what I taught them, they improved it. How modern hydraulic chain binders. I'd always used manual binders, ratchet type, but Price pointed out that hydraulic binders could maintain constant tension even as the log rotated, could compensate for compression, could do things manual binders couldn't. Grit's voice filled with something that sounded like pride. I'd been doing this for 40 years. 40 years. And this 32-year-old woman showed me something I'd never considered. She took my father's technique from 1944 and made it better, made it modern, kept the fundamentals but upgraded the execution. Did it work? That MRAP walked out of the sand like it was on a parade ground. 8 minutes. The male soldiers stood there with their mouths open. And Price, she looked at that sergeant who'd made the bet and she said, I don't want your stakes. I want you to teach this to your men. Because next time you get stuck, I might not be around to save your ass. Grit laughed. A real laugh. Deep and genuine. That sergeant became one of her best students, learned everything she taught, and 6 months later his unit got stuck in a wadi during a firefight. Used the patent twist with hydraulic binders. Saved 4 lives. They pulled up to the FOB gate. A guard waved them through. That's what I learned in Iraq, Grit said. The best teachers are humble enough to learn from their students. Tradition doesn't mean stagnation. It means foundation. You build on the foundation. As they drove the final mile to the field hospital, Grit told the last 2 stories quickly. Afghanistan 2008, the impossible 45-degree ravine, double log method, wounded men saved. And finally the 6th story, the real reason he was there. 2 months ago, Grit said as they pulled into the hospital compound, I went to the VA. They found something. My heart. 79 years of stress and war and carrying weight has worn it down. They said 6 months. Maybe a year if I'm lucky. Reese's breath caught. No. It's all right, Lieutenant. I'm 79 years old. I've had a good run, longer than my father. But I knew I had one thing left to do, one last person to teach, one last chance to fulfill the promise I made when I read about your father's death. Today was that moment. You were that person. The generators were being unloaded. Medical personnel rushing, efficient, urgent. You're my last student, Grit said, and my best one, because you learned humility, and now you'll teach others. Colonel Hayes met them at the hospital entrance, took in the situation with a glance, listened to Reese's explanation, looked at Grit with newfound respect. Write it up, Lieutenant, Hayes said. After action report. I want this method in our training curriculum. If it saved your mission, it needs to save others. They delivered the generators, 40 minutes ahead of schedule. 12 patients kept breathing. 12 lives saved by logs and chains and 80 years of knowledge. As they prepared to leave, Reese saw a civilian pickup stuck in mud 5 miles from base. A pregnant woman, 2 scared children. She didn't hesitate. Brennan, get the logs. She taught the civilian father the patent twist, explained it the way Grit had explained it to her. Watched his truck climb free, watched him drive away to safety. Grit stood to the side, watching, smiling. You did good, Lieutenant. Real good. The next morning, Reese brought her company to the stuck site. 20 soldiers, 30, more. They formed ranks in the mud. Master Sergeant Grit Ashford, she said, for 42 years you served. For 79 years you've carried the weight of knowledge that refuses to die. Yesterday you saved my mission, saved 12 lives, saved me from becoming my father. She came to attention. Company attention. 30 soldiers snapped to. Thank you, Sergeant Major. She saluted. Held it. Perfect. Grit returned the salute, his hand shaking slightly, but steady where it mattered. Keep them rolling, Lieutenant, he said. Keep them rolling. Winter came to Georgia. Grit walked the trails slower now, the cane necessary, his heart struggling. But he walked, because walking meant teaching. Every month he came to Fort Benning, told the 6 stories, showed his father's journal. 200 soldiers learned, then 500, then 1,000. Captain Reese Callahan, promoted now, taught beside him, had written a manual, had created the Ashford Patent Method training program. On a February morning 6 months after the day in the rain, Grit walked into the Fort Benning Museum. They'd created an exhibit, his father's journal in a climate-controlled case, his own cane beside it. The plaque read, "These tools walk through 8 decades of service." Carried by PFC James Ashford and MSG Grit Ashford, who taught generations that knowledge never dies. Legacy eternal. Footsteps behind him. Reese stood there with 10 young lieutenants. Fresh, eager. One stood out. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, 23, MIT graduate. Same confidence Reese had once carried. Sergeant Major, Reese said, my students want to hear the 6 stories from you. They sat, right there in the museum. And Grit told them, all 6 stories, his voice strong, clear, a teacher fulfilling his purpose. Master Sergeant Grit Ashford died on a Tuesday in late April, quietly, in his sleep, his daughter's picture on the nightstand, his father's journal beside it, his promise kept. 2,000 soldiers attended the funeral. They came because he'd taught them, saved them, made them better. At the graveside, Captain Callahan spoke. He taught me that pride kills and humility saves. That observation beats calculation. That impossible is just a word. That legacy isn't what you achieve, it's what you pass on. She saluted the casket. Rest easy, Sergeant Major. The knowledge lives on. The chain is unbroken. And we will keep them rolling. The soldiers dispersed, but Reese stayed, stood there looking at the fresh earth, at the flame, at the end of a life lived in service. A voice behind her. Ma'am. She turned. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell stood there hesitant. I just got my first independent command, Sarah said. Convoy through the training grounds tomorrow, and the weather report says rain. Reese smiled, sad and knowing and proud. Then you listen to Sergeant Brennan when he tells you about the weather. You trust your eyes more than your iPad. And if you get stuck, you remember what Sergeant Major Ashford taught us. Sarah nodded. Logs and chains. Logs and chains. The young lieutenant walked away, and Reese stood there understanding that this was how it worked, how it would always work, one generation teaching the next. An unbroken chain stretching back to 1944 and forward into eternity. She touched her hand to her heart, to where Grit's lessons lived. Thank you, she whispered to the grave. Thank you for waiting 6 years to save me. The wind carried her words away, but somewhere she believed they were heard. 3 weeks later, Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell got stuck in mud, not badly, but stuck. She didn't panic, didn't call for heavy recovery. She got out, looked at the mud, really looked, chose the right logs, rigged the chains. And when her truck climbed free on wooden legs, when her soldiers cheered, when she felt the pride of solving the unsolvable, she understood. She understood what Grit had taught Reese, what Reese was teaching her, what she would teach the next generation. Knowledge doesn't die. Not if someone is brave enough to pass it forward. Not if someone is humble enough to learn. The chain continues, unbroken. From a frozen forest in 1944 to a muddy road in 2024 and beyond. From father to son to stranger to student. From Patton to James to Grit to Reese to Sarah to the next and the next and the next, immortal. Forever. The way it was always meant to be.